Well, good afternoon. My name's David Fair, and this is the introduction video for the Yellow Paper, which is a project I've been working on for this year to present to Parliament, and every sitting parliamentarian and a great deal of tertiary level professors in psychology and philosophy are soon to receive one of these packs, which very simply has inside of it 37-page document, which I've titled The Yellow Paper, and a copy of The Traveller's Guide to the Third Dimension, and I'm working on a cover letter at the moment. But the reason that I am producing this paper is to draw attention, not that it really needs to be drawn, but to draw attention to the state of mental health and the alarming rise of the numbers of suicides that are happening amongst predominantly our young people and predominantly our black young people or Indigenous young people. But I don't want to single out any one particular group. I mean, across the board and globally, suicide rates are on the increase. Although in the last couple of years, I think in this general area, there has been a slight decrease, but that could be the doctoring of the official statistics. Because I have been told by official channels that I have approached over the last few years that nobody wants to talk about suicide anymore, and we're trying not to cause any media panic or whatever because of the ripple effect. And to me, that's ridiculous. I've spent the last 5 or 6 years working on a project called the Suicide and Spirituality Project, of which this yellow paper, I guess, is a kind of a culmination of everything that I've gleaned, I guess, from being an outsider in the field of suicide. However, having had lived experience myself in my early 20s of committing suicide, or I should say trying to commit suicide, and waking up in the hospital, I do have a very passionate and connected understanding with the reasons that people attempt to commit suicide. Primarily, that the main reason being the existential angst of life, which is born within us as this kind of irritation or emptiness that we can't quite put our finger on, yet it aggravates everything, and it's there in our relationships, it's there in our workplace, and we look out and we see the futility and the pointlessness of a world that seems to offer us no true purpose. And to that end, after my attempt at suicide, I spent 10 years looking for purpose and couldn't find it. I tried drugs and alcohol. That didn't work. And I guess the alcohol was more of a crutch, but the drugs were an experimental way to try and find something else. I'd read a bit about illuminating experiences. I don't want to dwell on that, however. And then I went in and out of lots of churches and mosques and temples and different places of worship, from the Brahma Kumari to the Baha'i to the Baptist Church, you name it, to the Vatican. Don't know why I went to the Vatican. But there was nothing there for me in any of those places, and I eventually collapsed to my knees at a point of futility and underwent the dark night of my soul. And through prayer in the middle of that dark night of my soul, I was answered by the Divine Lord, by God, by Universal Mind, whatever you want to call that, answered by a voice which led me to a book called A Course in Miracles. And from that day to this, I've been learning from that book, referencing that book, and teaching the auspices of that book to anyone who will listen and anyone who's willing to be open-minded to a new way to see the world. Now, that's partially what I'm presenting, a brief of that in here, as a offering towards, or an offering to the education system that is presented in this country on a primary school level. I have no program in place. My goal and my aim in this, I think, is more to just inspire, to open dialogue, and to present fresh and new ideas about the human condition and the alternative to the human condition that I think, from my 22 years of involvement with recovery programs and social outreach and stuff like that through the church that I was a member of, and still facilitate social programs today, that I think is missed. I think that the one time, and I would have to refer to this in a religious context, but I think that there would have been a one-time thing in this country where generational information about spiritual ideas would have been passed down, talked about around the dinner table, and now, of course, and of course in church on Sundays, but now, of course, with the breakdown of the family units, drugs, alcohol, and all the other influences, the pressures of the home and everything else, life is too busy and too complicated and too messy. It's sort of collapsing in on itself across the social landscape to be able to actually allow the time for parents to investigate spiritual parameters, and not only investigate them, but to put them into practice in their lives so that they can pass them on to their kids. And I remember listening to the dinner table conversations of my parents to their parents, and realizing that my grandmothers, predominantly my grandmothers, were quite wise women, and they had a lot of very common sense, practical, spiritually based know-how that they'd been using in their lives to deal with situations that they found through their faith. And I see that with the decline in people going to church these days, a drastic decline, and I'm not going to comment on that. I know why, but with that decline, and with the decline of people taking an interest in spirituality, especially in Australia, I just looked at a graph the other day. I was just interested in what the population across the globe is of people, in a general sense, that are interested in spirituality. In Australia was right down there in the bottom, like, maybe 20% of people might take a small interest. And many other countries across the world have like a 40 to 70%, and then some countries are even greater than that, where I guess religious participation is mandatory. Such as in Thailand, where the firstborn son in every family, I think it is encouraged to become a monk, and there is a very respectful and Buddhist-oriented way of living that is permeated through the lifestyles of the people there, that goes hand in hand with their work and everything else, and their family and their relationships, and it's very beautiful. So my proposition is to try and put something in place in a primary school level where meditation and spirituality and the knowledge of inner self are looked at seriously from grade 1 to grade 7, not just as 5 minutes of meditation in the morning or in the afternoon, but as something that is taught expansively throughout those years through, let's say, the vast sea of materials that are available for children now, and for adults as well, to do with spirituality in a very open-minded and non-religious way, in a very universal way. And I know a lot of people that I've spoken to over the years about things like this. I say, I don't want my kids to learn about God and, and all of this. And some people have an actual phobia and a fear about it. And when you explain to people that God is the power of your mind, right? God is a word that means I am. And when people understand that you're talking about your own higher power, not some guy in the sky that's waiting to cast you to hell or heaven, then the mood of things changes, the conversations change. It's like, I can look at those ideas, I'm willing to be open-minded there. And, and then you go further and you realize that spirituality is really the embodiment of spiritual principles such as tolerance and patience and acceptance, generosity, giving and receiving. You have to be generous to yourself, so receiving, and forgiveness, absolutely forgiveness. And the recognition that we are all here together as one, And our life is a series of lessons. Our life is a series of learning situations which we come together as in relationships, which have the opportunity to show us stuff about ourselves, which if we have these principles to apply to the thoughts and the cycles of thoughts that we hold about ourselves in our own mind, which may be uncreative and self-sabotaging and that sorts of things, then we can pull ourselves out of our depression, out of our anxiety, and learn to be grateful for the opportunities before they spiral out of control and see us in a dark pit of depression and becoming suicidal, etc., or reaching for drugs or alcohol. So, and one of the things that is really prevalent for me at the moment, or really on my mind at the moment, a couple of nights ago when I was researching a little bit of data, I came across a graph of it was a picture of the globe, all the countries of the globe, about mental health and drug dependency and stuff I was looking up. And Australia is up there with Iceland and Iraq as far as being the most prominent or the leading countries in the world that are struggling with a high rate of mental illness and drug dependency. Iceland, Iraq, and Australia were the three leading countries. Now that's probably, America didn't, I would have thought America would be up there, but I don't know what's in Iceland. I didn't even know people live there really, but I guess for their small population, I don't know what population, maybe I'll have to look at that, But you can understand that in a country like Iceland where I guess it's bitterly cold and covered in ice, people would turn to alcohol in a sense, and you would be indoors. It's very much like England when I visited England, and everything happens in the local pubs pretty much, or theatres and things, but everybody's indoors and drinking. And Australian culture has a big, a big element of drinking about it. But the statistics that I were reading and the information that I was reading about this particular thing was fueled by the dependency on alcohol and the dependency on drugs, and the statistical references for each of those countries based on the state of mental health that they were confessing to, I guess, or keeping a record of. So, and to that end, I have here a copy, and it's printed on yellow paper, a copy of the 2017 National Report on Mental Health and Suicide Prevention. And whilst I've read this, and whilst it's not particularly encouraging, there are some points wherein the attempt to come together as a unified nation and tackle the issues that this outlines, the attempt to come together is there, and it's stipulated in many of the parts that the divestment of skills across the board is something that makes it very difficult for that coming together, because in different areas and regional and cities and whatever, there are people with more skills, less skills, etc. So with the idea of training people through primary school, this is obviously going to be an ongoing generational thing, because we don't want to keep spiraling and become the leading worst country in the world. But with the idea of training people through primary schools, there is a national curriculum towards an approach that is systemic in the country, right, to tackle mental health, suicide, etc., etc., etc. And at the moment, we don't have that. Beyond Blue has just brought out something, or they have something called Be You or Be Me or something. I haven't really looked into that, but I heard about it the other day. And I'm very much taken with the work of Professor Laura D'Olimpia, who's currently residing in England. And I have not been able to get in touch with her, despite sending several emails and making a few phone calls. Very inspired by her work with children. She's a professor in children's psychology and philosophy, I believe, something like that. But anyway, but the overall, there's plenty of stuff there. And in England now, 370 state schools in England, I think it is, have just embarked upon a spiritual, meditational kind of program for young kids. And I'm very encouraged by that. But I would like to see it go further. I would like to see it go to the point where children are able to reason for themselves when they leave school. They're not just going to fit into a tax-paying bracket. I want to be able to see children that leave school as trailblazers, not followers, so that they feel empowered because they have the power of their own thought to examine themselves in relationship to any situation, rather than looking outside themselves, seeing where they fit in with that situation and then having to make a decision about this, that, and the other. Because that's not living. You have to find yourself within, in relationship to whatever situation's presenting you with, and then make a decision by deferring to your own inner guidance for that. And I think kids these days are so locked into the idea of referencing things externally, which is fine as a secondary nature, but primarily kids need to learn to think for themselves. And one of the things that I mentioned in the yellow paper is that in the last couple of years, I have a shop in town. I've employed 2 part-time staff, neither of who can read a Roman face clock with the hands. They need a digital, and they just simply couldn't read it. And people will put the argument that, well, we don't need those clocks anymore. Everything's going digital these days. And it's like, it's not about learning to read the clock. It's about the problem-solving activation of the thought processes of the mind that enables that child to go, all right, let me look at that, and let me look at that, and work it out for themselves what that clock is, what it says, rather than just look outside on their phone or on the computer or somewhere else and go, oh, the time is. It's about activating this. This is the most powerful tool we have. And if we're brought out just as, if we exit the education system just as robots with heads full of facts and heads full of information, basically all we are is filing cabinets. We haven't actually learned to use our cognitive powers of thought process to see what it is that's in our own best interests in each situation. And our lives, our relationships reflect it, and the nature of mental health in the country at the moment reflects it. There's 75 pages of basically people trying to keep their own jobs in that, and I don't mean to sound rude, but I mean, when you read this, it's not like startlingly revelatory, full of answers and stuff. It's kind of like, well, we're trying to do this and we're trying to do that, and it's horrible. Whereas this is 35 pages of pure answers. And I know that it works because the little book, The Traveller's Guide to the Third Dimension, that I put out, which has some basic universal philosophy in it, and some workbook lessons from A Course in Miracles, the reviews of the first 50. I know it works because I give this to people, they read it and their lives change. All of a sudden they come back to me and say, I never thought you could see the world that way. I never thought about things in that light. This is produced by people that have no clue. They're clinging to what they've been taught. They're trying to come together. They're trying to work it out. You've got to stop trying to work it out and start letting things flow. Start opening the minds. Start being responsive to things that aren't in your textbooks, to things that don't come with a university degree. There are plenty of solutions for everything, in the world, and there's no need that people become dependent on drugs to manage their lives. There's no need that people go through relationship after relationship being abused and feeling beaten down by it and everything. There's no need that people look out into the world and see a pointless, meaningless world and they might just go and neck themselves. You have a purpose here. Your purpose is to find yourself. You're on a journey of the soul, and your relationships are your classroom. Your relationships are your learning tools. If you don't know how to process what goes on within the framework of your relationships, whether they be with your spouse and loved ones, whether they be with somebody at the supermarket, whether they be with an inanimate object, right? It's in here that everything is going on. And the processing of all of those thoughts and everything about your relationships should be able to come together in you with the simple decision to have inner peace in your life and to learn to use your relationships to foster that sense of inner peace and stay true to it through the application of the principles of forgiveness, tolerance, patience, and all of those sorts of things, which we are not taught in schools. And the other little aside that I just want to put out there for the yellow paper, I'll just make a few comments in there about democracy and the nature of the way things are run in the government now, in that also in schools we're not taught about democracy. I left school not knowing really what democracy was. I didn't know how to participate in it. I didn't know who I should be voting for. I didn't know how to find out information about who I should be voting for. I was just sort of pushed out into the world and fed a load of spin-doctored kind of stuff every election, every election cycle, and left to basically guess who might have my best interests at heart. There was nobody that was standing up saying, love is your best interest. And from a loving perception of the world comes the world that you actually want to live in. All right, well, that's about it. I'll be mailing these out soon. I'm just working on the cover letter. I just wanted to do this video as an update, and I might even use this video as the primary video on the website, which is www.findingme.net.au. And if you get one of these in the mail, and every single politician is going to, if you get one of this one's going to Honourable DJ Chester MP, member for Gippsland. G'day, Mr. Chester. If you get one of these in the mail, please take it seriously. Please have a good look at it and just let it in. Try not to be judgmental. The stuff that you read in there, much of it is going to be brand new to you. You're never going to have come across it before, and that's a pretty good chance. I'm betting that. But and the reason for that is because most of you guys down there in Canberra are doctors and lawyers and people of that kind, and I'm willing to bet there's not too many philosophers. It's about time you had a few philosophers in the mix down there, I think, and helped to put a more polished perspective on the reason for life and the reason for the job that you're doing and the reason for the willingness that people have in this country to keep supporting you in your positions that you've chosen to undertake to represent us. I guarantee you that most people think you're not doing a very good job. But anyway, you can only work with what you know, and very soon you're going to have something else that you will know that will help you. And I hope it does help you. From my heart to your heart, God bless.